They came instead with toolkits slung across their shoulders, portable diagnostic units humming at their belts, and, inexplicably, charmingly, small metal cups filled with something dark and steaming. 12 of them boarded the Verex 17 within minutes of docking, and their energy was so immediate and purposeful that the Verex crew instinctively stepped back to give them room, not out of fear but out of sheer surprise. The aliens had expected formality. They had expected careful professionals maintaining precise diplomatic distance, the way most species behave when boarding a foreign military vessel. What they got instead was a team of humans who moved through the damaged corridors of the Verex 17 the way people move through their own homes, with comfort, with curiosity, with the casual confidence of those who are extremely good at what they do and see no reason to perform modesty about it. The lead engineer was a woman of middle age, with close-cropped silver hair and grease already on her hands before she touched a single panel. She found the primary engine housing, looked at it for approximately 4 seconds, and let out a low whistle of professional assessment. "Okay," she said, almost to herself. "They really did a number on you." She turned and offered Captain Ralvec a small, reassuring smile. "Don't worry. We've seen worse. Well," she paused, tilting her head, "we've seen comparable. But the point stands. We'll have her running." Her team was already spreading through the ship before she finished speaking. Ralvec watched them work with growing bewilderment. He had hired repair crews at 40 different ports across his career. He had never seen anything like this. Panels he hadn't even flagged as damaged were found and addressed. Burned relays were not just replaced but upgraded with components that his chief engineer, Dava, had never seen in any standard catalog. When Dava pointed this out to the human technician responsible, the young man just grinned and said, "We adjusted the power distribution architecture a little. Your engines will put out about 20% more thrust at equivalent fuel consumption." Dava stared at him. "That is not a repair." "No," the technician agreed cheerfully. "It's an improvement. Is that a problem?" It was not a problem. It was deeply, profoundly confusing, which Ralvec were beginning to understand, was a state that humans seemed to produce in other species quite naturally and without particular effort. The work continued for hours. Shield emitters came back online one by one, their power signatures noticeably stronger than before. Weapon systems rebooted with new targeting matrices already installed, matrices that, when Dava examined them later, turned out to improve tracking speed by nearly 30%. Hull breaches were sealed with a bonding compound that, according to the material analysis, was actually stronger than the original hull plating. And threaded quietly through all of it, woven into the new code like a signature hidden in plain sight, were enhancements that no one had mentioned aloud. Emergency jump calculations had been optimized for combat scenarios. Shield regeneration cycling had been accelerated. Sensor resolution had been sharpened to a degree that took 3 of Ralvec's officers over an hour to fully map. The humans hadn't just repaired the Verex 17. They had quietly, methodically, transformed her into a better warship, and then said nothing about it. Through all of this, the engineers asked only one question, and they asked it gently, almost as an afterthought, near the end of the repair cycle. "Who attacked you?" Ralvec told them. He gave the name of the pirate empire, the Krath Syndicate, a loose confederation of predators who had been growing bolder along the outer trade corridors for the better part of 2 years. The lead engineer nodded slowly. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her coffee cup, and when she finally said something, it was only 2 syllables. "Ah!" Just that, a soft, quiet exhalation of understanding. No anger crossed her face. No alarm. She simply absorbed the information the way a physician absorbs a patient's symptoms, cataloging, processing, deciding. Ralvec watched her carefully and felt, for the first time since entering human space, genuinely uncertain about what he was looking at. The invitation came as repairs reached their final stages. "Earth Orbital Command requests your presence. Captain Ralvec. Docking Bay 7, Messer Station. For coffee." Ralvec read the message twice. Then he looked at Soreth, who looked back at him with an expression that said he had no useful advice to offer. "Coffee," Soreth said, again with a coffee. The lounge was on the station's upper tier, and it had the feeling of a room designed by people who understood that important conversations benefited from beautiful surroundings. Wide observation windows ran along an entire wall, offering an unobstructed view of Earth below, vast blue oceans threaded with cloud, continents lit warmly at their edges by the curve of the sun. Ralvec had seen many worlds from orbit. None had looked quite like this. There was something about Earth that was impossible to reduce to tactical data. Several human officers were already present. Seated or standing near the windows were the unhurried of people who had no reason to perform urgency. They wore no visible weapons. Their voices were quiet. When a tall human officer with the insignia of a fleet commander stepped forward and offered Ralvec a cup, the alien captain accepted it with careful hands. The drink was warm. The smell alone was something. Dark and complex, a fragrance that seemed to contain layers, like walking into a room where something important had just been decided. He tasted it, bitter at first, then smooth, then something that lingered on the back of his tongue like an afterthought he couldn't quite name. He understood suddenly why humans offered this at every significant moment. It gave everyone something to do with their hands while they thought about difficult things. The questions began simply. How many ships in the attacking force? What weapon classifications had been observed? What was the approximate jump direction after the engagement? Ralvec answered. He had no particular reason not to. The attack was not a secret, and the Krath Syndicate operated openly enough that their movements were known to most serious navigators along the outer routes. As he spoke, he noticed that every answer he gave was being received not just by the officer across from him, but by something beyond. Screens behind the humans that he could only partially see, data moving across them faster than he could follow, maps updating, markers appearing in sectors he recognized. They were not having a conversation. They were running a briefing, and he was the primary source. Outside the lounge windows, Earth's orbit was shifting. Vessels that had been stationary for as long as the Verex 17 had been docked were now moving, slowly, almost lazily, with a particular calm of things that have no reason to hurry because they are already exactly where they need to be. You repair ships often? Ralvec asked, keeping his voice neutral. The human commander smiled. It was a genuine smile, warm, even kind. We help those who ask. And if someone attacks your guests. He chose the word deliberately. The humans fell quiet, not awkwardly, comfortably, the way people go quiet when they're considering how to say something they have thought about a great deal. We make sure, the commander said finally, her voice carrying neither anger nor theater, that it doesn't happen again. Ralvec set down his coffee cup. In 30 years of commanding vessels across a galaxy full of bluster and political performance, he had heard threats in 100 forms. He had heard empires issue proclamations of devastating retaliation while their fleets were half mothballed and their supply chains were in collapse. He had heard warlords promise obliteration over communication channels while quietly signaling their readiness to negotiate. He had never heard anything quite like this. There was no performance in her words, no weight of implication pressed into them for effect. She had spoken with the same tone someone might use to describe weather, or traffic, or any other fact that simply was. It was the most frightening thing Ralvec had heard in 30 years. The Verex 17 departed as a local star moved toward its lower arc, painting Earth's horizon in colors that had no precise equivalent in Verex visual terminology, something between copper and rose, something that did not translate. You are free to depart, the docking controller said. Safe travels, Verex 17. The cruiser eased away from the station. Her engines ran at a smooth, deep pitch that none of her crew had ever heard from her before, a sound of genuine health, better than new. The stars ahead were clear. The path home was open. And then space changed. It began as a visual distortion, a quality of light bending at the edges of nothing, the way heat rises from hot ground. Then shadows appeared where there had been only vacuum. At first one, then 3, then a dozen, then more than Ralvec could count. Vast shapes peeled themselves out of nothing as cloaking fields dropped away one by one, each decloak producing a brief shimmer and then the sudden, solid, overwhelming reality of a warship that had been present all along. Battleships, carrier-class vessels large enough to house entire air wings within their hulls. Destroyers in tight formation, their silhouettes clean and angular and unmistakably purposeful. Frigates moving in coordinated patterns that spoke of deep training, of units that had drilled these formations until they could perform them without a single transmitted command. They filled space on every side, not surrounding the Verex 17, surrounding everything. They were not a welcome party, and they were not a threat to the cruiser. They were a fleet revealing itself, and they had been there the entire time. Silent, hidden, watching. Ralvec's tactical officer whispered something under her breath in Verex, an old phrase, one of those idioms that resists clean translation, but which carries a meaning something like, the depth of the water was never visible from the surface. These ships, a junior officer breathed beside her. Were they here for us? The question hung in the air unanswered for exactly 3 seconds before the communication system activated. Captain Ralvec. The voice was new, unhurried, authoritative, carrying the specific weight of someone who was accustomed to very large decisions. This is Sol Defense Command. Admiral Reyes speaking. A pause. Not a dramatic one, a functional one, the pause of someone organizing clear information for clear delivery. Your attackers have been located. We do not allow our guests to leave unprotected. We will escort you to the edge of our recognized space, at which point our engagement will transition from escort to active enforcement. The Krath Syndicate has been advised of their options. Ralvec found his voice. Their options. Stand down and disperse, the Admiral said, or don't. There was, again, no theater in it, no relish, just a flat, factual recitation of available outcomes. Outside, the fleet was already moving, not with the chaos of a force scrambling to engage, with the enormous, quiet coordination of a machine that had already decided. Engines lit across 100 ships simultaneously. Formation geometry shifted in second from defensive dispersal to offensive wedge. The stars ahead stretched slightly as the first vessels reached the edge of faster-than-light transition. Ralvec looked at Sorath. Sorath looked back at him with the expression of a man who has spent 40 years believing he understood how power worked, and has just discovered he was missing several chapters. Put us in the center of the formation, Ralvec said quietly. Sorath nodded without a word and transmitted the request. The response came immediately, a gentle redirect from the fleet's navigation authority, guiding the Verex 17 into the protected heart of the formation, as though the space had already been reserved for her. Which, Ralvec realized, it probably had. The Krath Syndicate's home system was known among navigators as a place you didn't enter unless you had numbers on your side or nothing left to lose. It had 6 inhabited stations, 2 fortified asteroid belts, and a defensive fleet that had repelled 3 separate government enforcement actions over the past decade. The Syndicate commanders were not reckless people. They had survived long enough to understand threat assessment, and they never engaged forces larger than their own without significant advantage. When the jump signatures appeared on their sensors, the initial reading produced exactly 2 words from the Syndicate's tactical station. 1 ship. Laughter spread through the command center. The pirate fleet commander, a thick-necked figure named Draken who had 20 years of successful predation behind him, leaned back in his chair and allowed himself the pleasure of contempt. 1 damaged alien cruiser, come limping back, perhaps looking for negotiation, perhaps foolish enough to think apology could undo the damage already done. Then the sensors updated. The laughter stopped so completely that the silence felt physical. The jump signatures were still resolving, still emerging from faster-than-light transition, and they were not stopping. Battleships, carriers, destroyers, configuration after configuration materializing on the tactical screen, until Draken's display was more red markers and black space, until his tactical officer's voice broke trying to give count, until the scale of what was appearing became genuinely, viscerally incomprehensible. This was what had been hiding behind the civilian stations. This was what had been listening to the distress call. Draken's communications officer was already opening frequencies. They are hailing us. His voice was controlled with visible effort. I know, Draken said. He straightened in his chair, because men like Draken believe until the very last moment that posture is meaningful. Put it through. Krath Syndicate Command, this is Admiral Reyes' Sol Defense Fleet. Her voice filled the command center with the same unremarkable calm that had apparently governed every human communication in this entire situation. You attacked a vessel under our protection. This is a courtesy notification. Stand down your fleet. Release all claims to the outer Kethra corridor, and we will limit our response to the recording of this incident in our permanent enforcement register. This offer expires in 60 seconds. 60 seconds. Not an hour. Not a day of negotiation. 60 seconds. Draken looked at his tactical display. He looked at his fleet strength. He did the kind of rapid, brutal arithmetic that keeps predators alive. His fleet outnumbered the human ships in total vessel count, though the size differential was significant. He had fixed defensive platforms. He had the home advantage. He had been here before, with different governments, and had made them pay enough for engagement that they chose retreat instead. What he had never faced was the specific quality of quiet. Every government force that had come before had broadcast warnings with escalating urgency. They had communicated anxiety. They had revealed, through their words, the degree to which they were hoping not to fight. These humans had not said a single word that suggested hope. They had described their intentions with the same neutral effect someone uses to describe a maintenance schedule. 20 seconds passed. Draken made his decision. He would show them the same thing he had shown every enforcement fleet that came to his door. He would make it hurt enough that Earth's political class would decide the cost wasn't worth the principle. Target their command ship, he said. Full fleet engagement. Let them feel. White light. It happened so fast that Draken's brain initially refused the process of its causation, the order, and then the light, with no perceptible interval between them. A single rail cannon round from a human battleship that, at the moment of firing, had not yet been where the targeting solution predicted it would be. The shell had been calculated on a prediction so accurate it amounted to certainty. The Syndicate flagship vanished inside a flash that turned space white from edge to edge, a light so total and so brief that it registered in every neural system in the command center as a primal, physical warning. This is what the end of the argument looks like. Shock waves rolled outward. Draken's remaining ships were still processing what had happened when the human fleet came apart into 100 individual operations, each destroyer and frigate moving with an independence and precision that looked, from the tactical screen, less like a military engagement and more like an industrial process, systematic, technical, and absolutely without waste. Pirate cruisers that attempted to maneuver found their escape vectors already covered. Defense platforms opened fire and was silenced within moments, not by overwhelming bombardment, but by targeted precision. Single shots to power cores, communication arrays, propulsion units. The humans were not destroying indiscriminately. They were disabling with a careful efficiency of people who had already decided exactly what outcome they were producing. Squadrons of fighters poured from carrier bays like silver currents in the dark, cutting off retreating vessels and holding them in place without destroying them, as though the humans had calculated that some of these ships would surrender and had already decided to let them. 11 minutes after the first shot, the Syndicate's command channels were flooding with surrender signals. 13 minutes after the first shot, the human fleet powered down its weapons. 15 minutes after the first shot, it was over. There was no cheering across the human communications network. No celebration. The fleet settled back into its formations with the same coordinated silence it had always maintained, and Admiral Reyes transmitted one final message to the remnants of the Krath Syndicate command infrastructure, to anyone in the system still capable of receiving it, and by extension to anyone they would ever speak to, in any port, around any table, for the rest of their lives. The outer Kethra corridor is under Sol Defense protection, effective immediately. This enforcement action is entered into permanent record. Good day. The Verex 17 turned for home under the quiet company of warships that would not be leaving until she was well beyond any possible threat. Captain Ralvec stood at the viewport for a long time, watching the stars. Beside him, Soreth was equally silent, the silence of someone reorganizing everything they thought they knew about how the galaxy was structured. When I was young, Ralvec said finally, my father told me that the truly dangerous powers are not the ones that threaten loudly. He said that a species willing to shout its strength has already admitted it needs you to be afraid of them. Soreth considered this, and a species that doesn't need you to be afraid doesn't shout, Ralvec said. He turned from the viewport. Behind them, through the observation windows, the human fleet held its formation, patient, silent, immense. It had been there the entire time. It would be there until the job was complete. And when the job was complete, it would return to its orbit around that blue and white world and settle back into the quiet business of waiting for the next distress signal. Not because it was ordered to, because it had decided this was the point. The Verex 17's engines hummed at a pitch our crew had never heard. Richer, steadier, a sound like something healed and made better than it had been. In Ralvec's quarters, untouched on his small desk, sat a metal cup still carrying the faint residue of cold coffee. He had meant to return it. He had forgotten, in the chaos of departure, and the humans had said nothing about it. He suspected that was intentional. across the galaxy. In the weeks and months that followed, the story of the Verex 17 moved the way important stories move. Through freight captains comparing notes over port dinners, through intelligence briefings in a dozen different government chambers, through the careful calculations of commanders who had once considered the outer trade routes as their particular hunting ground, and were now revising those calculations significantly. The Krath Syndicate dissolved within a season, not destroyed precisely, but unmade, its commanders dispersed and its memberships unwilling to reconstitute under any banner that might attract a second visit from Sol Defense. Other pirate confederations read the record of the engagement so many times it became standard tactical education material in 3 separate military academies, not as a blueprint for their own operations, but as a permanent reference for what to avoid. Independent analysts published long papers on the human response profile, the geometry of the fleet deployment, the targeting methodology, the conspicuous restraint applied to surrendering vessels, the absolute precision applied to everything else. The most widely circulated conclusion was also the simplest. Earth had not gone to war. Earth had performed a calibrated enforcement action on behalf of a vessel it had known for less than a day, and it had performed that action with the same unhurried certainty with which it had offered coffee and upgraded engines and asked gentle questions over a window looking out on blue oceans. This was more frightening, most analysts agreed, than any display of raw power could have been. Raw power could be measured and matched and eventually counted. What humans had demonstrated was not power but philosophy, a coherent, deeply settled conviction about what kind of universe they intended to maintain within their reach, combined with a calm patience to simply wait until maintenance was required. In the furthest reaches of charted space, in systems that had never seen a human face or received a human transmission, this understanding arrived ahead of any formal diplomatic contact and changed the calculations made in command rooms that Earth didn't even know existed. You could argue with a strong navy. You could negotiate with an empire that needed something from you. You could not meaningfully resist a species that had decided, without anger, without pride, without the need to be recognized for it, that protecting those who asked for protection was simply what they did. Somewhere in Earth Orbital Command, as another shift began and another watch officer settled into their station, a new signal arrived on the distress frequency. A different vessel, a different species. The same darkness. The watch officer noted the origin coordinates, flagged the vessel's damage profile, cross-referenced the attack signature, and opened a response channel, all within 30 seconds, moving with the unhurried efficiency of someone performing a familiar task they are very good at. "Unknown vessel," she said, and her voice was warm. "This is Earth Orbital Control. We've received your distress call." She reached for her coffee cup. "Help is on the way." The alien cruiser Verex 17 drifted through space like a wounded animal bleeding into the dark. Once, she had been a proud vessel, her hull gleaming, her engines singing with a deep, resonant hum of a ship that knew its own power. Now, those same engines burned unevenly, coughing fire in unsteady rhythms like a heart struggling to find its beat. Her shields flickered in and out, casting pale, dying light across her scarred exterior. Smoke curled through the lower decks in thick gray ribbons, and the sharp smell of burned circuitry had settled into every corridor like a bad memory that refused to leave. Hours earlier, pirates had ambushed them near the Kethera trade routes. The attack had come without warning, the way the worst things always do. One moment, space was empty and silent. The next, pirate interceptors had dropped out of stealth on all sides, their weapons already charged, their intentions already decided. The assault was fast, brutal, and merciless. 2 escort ships were destroyed before their crews could even raise shields. The Verex 17 had only survived because her helmsman had made a desperate, almost suicidal jump calculation in under 4 seconds, a decision that had torn stress fractures across 3 decks but kept the ship alive. Barely. On the bridge, Captain Ralvec stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture deliberately still. He was a tall figure among his crew, broad-shouldered, with the characteristic deep-set amber eyes of the Verex people. He said nothing. His silence was not uncertainty. It was a kind of quiet that a commander cultivates deliberately, the kind that tells a frightened crew that someone is still in control even when everything is falling apart. His officers waited, their eyes moving between their damaged consoles and their captain, near a safe system. Ralvec finally asked, his voice low and measured. A young navigation officer looked up from her flickering terminal, hesitating a fraction of a second too long. "The Sol system, Captain." She paused. Human territory. The bridge went very quiet. Ralvec turned the word over in his mind. Humans. Across the known galaxy, few species generated as much conflicting information as humans did. Merchant guilds described them as enthusiastic traders who would spend 3 hours debating the merits of different fermentation processes before negotiating contract. Military intelligence files painted a far less charming picture, a species that had emerged from a single violent world, survived catastrophe after catastrophe through sheer, stubborn refusal to die, and somehow managed to build one of the most quietly formidable defensive networks in the explored galaxy. Travelers who had visited their world spoke of warm welcomes, extraordinary food, and the strange human custom of offering hot beverages to anyone who seemed troubled. Commanders who had made the mistake of threatening human-aligned vessels spoke of something else entirely, if they survived to speak at all. Ralvec had never met a human. He had read enough to know that was not necessarily a reassuring fact. But his engines were failing, his crew was exhausted, and he had no other options. Send the distress signal, he ordered. The message traveled across the DAC, crossing light years in seconds. Ralvec expected a delay. Bureaucratic processing, verification checks, the usual interstellar caution. What he did not expect was an almost immediate response, as though it had been listening for exactly this frequency. Unknown vessel, this is Earth orbital control. The voice on the other end was calm, genuinely, unhurriedly calm, in a way that Ralvec found immediately unusual. Most emergency channels carried at least a trace of tension. This human sounded as though receiving a distress call from a damaged alien warship was simply a routine part of their afternoon. We've received your distress signal. Docking coordinates have been transmitted to your navigation array. Medical teams and engineering crews are standing by. Safe approach. That was it. No demand for identification codes. No warnings about weapons being trained on the incoming vessel. No political conditions attached to assistance. Ralvec's officers exchanged glances across the bridge. His first officer, a weathered Verex veteran named Soreth, leaned toward him and murmured, "They didn't even ask who we are." "No," Ralvec said quietly, studying the coordinates on his screen. "They didn't." As the Verex 17 limped toward Earth, her long-range scanners, damaged as they were, began piecing together an image of the system that didn't quite match the civilian charts on record. Massive energy signatures lurked behind what appeared to be commercial way stations. Enormous structural forms were present in orbit that civilian infrastructure simply didn't need. The reading suggested power generation on a scale that made his tactical officer quietly update her threat assessment 3 times in 10 minutes. And yet the human voices on the communication channels remained perfectly pleasant. Calm faces appeared on their view screens. Engineers in practical gray uniforms, a medical coordinator who smiled and asked whether any crew members required immediate attention, a docking officer who guided them in with the practiced patience of someone who had done this 1,000 times. No weapons were visible. No warships presented themselves in challenge formation. The crew of Verex 17 slowly released breath they hadn't realized they were holding. Perhaps, Ralvec thought, the more alarming stories about humans were exaggerations. Perhaps Earth truly was simply a well-equipped neutral port, a crossroad world that had grown prosperous by being useful to everyone. But deep within the orbital station, far below the warmly lit arrival bays and the smiling faces on the screens, quiet systems were coming to life. Scans had already catalogued every impact scar on the Verex 17's hull, identified the specific weapon signatures responsible, and cross-referenced them against 3 separate intelligence databases. Earth knew exactly who had done this, and Earth was already deciding what to do about it. The human engineers arrived with no weapons and no armor.